Hello and welcome to my channel TFF. My name is Jouni Vilkka. This video is about the history of Finland in the 19th and 20th centuries. So it's a very brief history, not just because the country itself is very young, only a little more than 100 years, but also because this video is really just a very superficial introduction. It's based on an essay that I wrote while I was studying history at the University of Tampere, and it's from 2002, so it's more than 20 years old, so not exactly the most recent cutting-edge stuff, but I'm kind of suffering from depression and anxiety, and this is hopefully helping me. Why the fuck am I telling you that? I don't know. Anyway, so first you gotta know that in the Middle Ages Finland was a part of the Kingdom of Sweden, the eastern part of the country. If you look at the map, you can see that geographically Finland and Sweden are not that different in size, but back then the area known as Finland wasn't quite as big as what you now see in a map as Finland, and also the population of Finland was very small compared to the population of Sweden, or at least significantly smaller. So in the kingdom it was a significant part of the Swedish kingdom, but it was not like half of the kingdom, but a very significant part anyway. So in 1809 Russia annexed Finland from Sweden, became a Grand Duchy under the Tsar of the Russian Empire, and later Finnish historians told this story so as to make it seem like the Tsar's idea had been to make Finland an autonomous Grand Duchy, but that was not really, according to more recent historians, that wasn't the plan. Actually, it was supposed to be that Finland was supposed to be just another part of the empire, but because during the 19th century Russia had a lot of trouble with people around Russia rebelling or otherwise being a nuisance to the Tsar. The Tsar figured it's better not to, make things too difficult for the Finnish, because the Finnish people were kind of obedient, nice subjects to the Tsar. So even though they considered themselves to be an autonomous Grand Duchy, and even though that didn't really have a justification in the founding of that Grand Duchy, the Tsar just didn't bother so much about it. Anyway, so there had been, while Finland was part of the Kingdom of Sweden, Finland had already had a local government for the eastern part of the kingdom, so to speak. So this government was kept intact by the Russians, so they didn't have to invent a whole new government or whole new way of doing things or governing the people in this area. So that kind of means that there was a kind of continuity from the medieval times to the 19th century and beyond in the Finnish government. Some parts of the government did not exist at this point because, for example, Finland under Russia did not have an army of its own, so anything to do with an army, I wasn't alive then, Finland didn't have anything like that. There were also some other significant changes, cultural changes that I'll come back to later. But the important thing is that when this splitting of the Swedish kingdom happened, the eastern part became a Grand Duchy for the Empire of Russia. At the same time, because this was a big change for the Kingdom of Sweden as well, Sweden itself also changed pretty significantly and gained kind of a different sense of nationality at that time. And probably because Sweden was more ready for that than Finland, the Finnish people did not exist really at that point. It took a while over the 19th century for there to begin to exist such a thing as the Finnish people. So, folk, if you will. This didn't exist until the later part of the 19th century. But it was possible for this to be created because when Russia was invading then the Kingdom of Sweden, the Finnish part, and occupying it, they did meet some resistance, mostly not big enough to make any difference really, but there was one battle where the Finnish people or the army fighting the Russians kind of proved that there was resistance to the Russians, and this sort of explains why Russia didn't just change the whole area and just make it just another Russian area. I don't know a proper word in this in English, but Russianization, is that a word? Anyway, this didn't happen, so they just let the local government to keep doing things pretty much the way they had been doing it, except that now it was under the Tsar's kind of personal rule, and so they were paying taxes to the Tsar, and that was the main difference. There was even no real effort to make the people here, even the elites, to speak Russian. So the elites, for the most part, kept speaking Swedish. And it took a while for these things to change. The people in Finland had been divided in various ways. Most obviously, language is one of the things that shows how different the people around the country were to each other. So there was no single Finnish people. In the coastal areas, in the eastern and southern parts of the country, there were lots of Swedish-speaking people, also some Finnish, but especially the elites spoke Swedish, and also a lot of the other people there who had populated basically from Sweden over the Middle Ages. They had populated the coastal areas, and so they even today there are Swedish-speaking people in those areas, a lot of them, and Swedish is still one of the national languages of Finland because of this. But anyway, then there were the Karelians in the eastern parts, and there were the Sami people further, mostly to the north. Reason why people teach the histories of their countries, and for also probably the reason why most people study the histories of their own countries, is nationalism, and I kind of hate nationalism. So, but the whole point here is just to give a broad understanding of what this whole thing is, how Finland came to be what it is. But the point is that there were all these different language groups, or even different peoples or ethnicities, like there still are, but back then they were more clearly distinct. These days, only the Sami people, who are, by the way, the Sami people are the only indigenous people in Europe, and so they still exist, and they actually speak several different languages, and I believe one of them is considered an official language in Finland today. But they have been treated pretty badly over the centuries, I suppose. But now there's more of an effort to make things right with them, or more right. But even in the 19th century, there were various different people in Finland. Even some new ethnic groups immigrated actually during the 19th century. The Tatars and the Jewish people. Small numbers of these both, but they didn't exist in Finland before that time. Finland remained mostly agrarian for a long time into the 20th century. In the middle of the 20th century, really, Finland was, even beyond the middle of the 20th century, Finland was mostly agrarian. So kind of a backwater, you might think, and you might not be too wrong. But anyway, so there was industry in Finland already in the 19th century, but it wasn't hugely significant. It was mostly started by, for example, people from Scotland and other places, but anyway, not people from Finland, because there was not that much capital or money in Finland, and Russia wasn't really investing a lot here, if at all. So one of the ways that Finnish production was protected was by using high tariffs, so that Finnish produce and production were protected by these high tariffs. So this enabled industry to develop in Finland. Usually those foreign investors who came here to start their industrial businesses, the factories, whatever, they usually went bankrupt and someone else bought their business. But those businesses kept on running all the way to the end of the 20th century, I think, and even beyond. One of the big industries beyond lumber mills was textile industry, which rather well. And for example, this city I live in, Tampere, is famous for its textile industry. In fact, Finnish people call Tampere the Manchester of Finland because of this connection. So Tampere was to Finland a bit like what Manchester was to the England or Britain. Anyway, so Finland was kind of a developing country at this point, not very highly industrialized anyway at any point during the 19th century, but cities were growing and people were moving into the cities, and some railroads were built from the new capital Helsinki to Viborg and then to Russia. And most of the foreign exports from Finland was to Russia and maybe elsewhere from Russia, but Russia was, for this whole time and beginning of the Second World War, really, I suppose, Russia was the main country where Finland exported things. So in the 19th century there was a huge crisis, a catastrophe. In 1867 and 1868 there were really bad crop failures, and that resulted in famine, and a lot of people died because of this. And at the time people thought of this as a natural thing, even though the ruling class was kind of afraid that this might lead to revolts, but it didn't. People accepted their fate and died. And the memory of this famine lasted for a long time and became important a bit later. So the vast majority of the people in the country lived in the countryside. And towards the end of the 19th century, more and more people were living in cities or towns, and this meant that kind of like barracks for the poor were built, and the level of hygiene in those places was not ideal, and so these poor people lived in the cities and suffered from the diseases that come from people living in too dense living conditions with poor hygiene, and they didn't really have access to medicine, and so getting sick was really bad and could result in death rather easily. And especially child mortality was very high. It was high also in the countryside, but not that high. Labor unions began to organize slowly, and the factories also employed women, which enabled women to have more choices in life beyond what the countryside and that kind of life allowed. So they didn't just have to marry or work as a maid somewhere. They could have a kind of a career of their own, although they were paid much less than men, but still it was maybe better, gave them more freedom over their own lives. Socialism made a breakthrough in Finland, in especially the general strike of 1905, when it became clear to people that by doing things together they could really make a difference. But before that, in 1903, the then Labour Party, later from then on the Social Democratic Party of Finland, had this made this Forza declaration, Forza program, where they, for example, demanded the separation of church and state, which still hasn't happened really, not completely. The socialists demanded the equal voting rights for everyone, and also getting church out of schools and banning the use of alcohol. A big part of the socialists were actually people from the countryside. Of course, the majority of the people in the working class in the cities supported socialists. Among the things that they demanded, well, the separation of church and state still isn't complete, but unfortunately what they did achieve, or not them alone, but one of the things that did happen was that there was a prohibition in Finland as well, and that was really harmful. But more about that maybe somewhere else. But what was really important was that the general strike made people think that they can actually get things done. They can change society by working together. And one of the reasons why people were really inspired by this, and what inspired them to sort of fight the power in this way, was the memory of the famine in the previous century. So people no longer thought that it was just natural for a lot of people to die of hunger, and they wanted to change society so that nothing like that would happen again. Finland had very little to do with the revolutions in Russia, but as a result of those revolutions, Finland became an independent country in 1917. The communists who took over Russia and created the Soviet Union assumed incorrectly that the working class in Finland would rebel and then join the whole country back to Russia or Soviet Union. But there never was really much of a desire to do that among even the socialists in Finland, or even the communists. So what did happen in Finland was that there was a civil war in 1918, and it was with the whites and the Reds being the working class, socialists, communists, whatever, the whites mostly the owning class and the farmers who owned land, for example, the upper class, anyway, all of those. And the whites won, and if you can call it winning, when you're in a civil war, there's basically no winners. But anyway, so the Reds lost, and a lot of them were taken prisoner. There were lots of executions and white terror, all kinds of evil shit. And so it was kind of understandable maybe that in the Soviet Union the communists thought that there is like a simmering hostility toward the capitalists among the Finnish masses all the way to the next decades and to the Second World War. But it wasn't quite like that. Not enough anyway. But after the Civil War, the so-called Spanish flu came to Finland as well, and again lots of people died because of that. And because of the Civil War, the country was not doing very well economically, and because of the flu and all the things that went wrong after that, and there was a need to, for example, somehow take care of the orphans of the Reds. By the way, there were quite a lot of women also fighting for the Reds, and they especially were executed, and they were considered really dangerous because not really of their effectiveness, but rather just because of their gender. That was considered really like a crime against God or something. So anyway, there had been a stable currency for a long time, but because there was inflation in the 20s, there was like right after the Spanish flu, for example, there was a recession, and then there was inflation, and this inflation seemed even worse than it was because it was unusual. And later, of course, in the same decade, there was another bigger recession. Significantly for the country, since Finland was no longer part of Russia, it also meant that it was more difficult to sell stuff to Russia, and Russia was not helping in any way, and also it was impossible to buy things like wheat, for example, from Russia, which was something that perhaps was needed. But also it meant that Finnish both farming and industry did not have to compete with Russian farming and industry. So that's also kind of partly good. Finland had been selling stuff to other countries in Europe as well, mostly lumber. But so they already had the contacts, the connections to Europe, so they could sell that stuff. But they also wanted to improve the technology and produce, for example, paper, but there was not yet any connections. There weren't any connections to buyers, so they had to find these connections in the 19th century and onwards. Infrastructure in Finland was not that good, so one of the things that had to be done was to improve the infrastructure, but that took time. And also there were certain changes done in the farming, creation of small farms, which was kind of good for the poor people who could get small farms to make a living, but for the productivity of the country, it perhaps was not that good. Anyway, also the middle class had gotten poorer because of the civil war and afterwards, so this meant that there weren't that great differences between the classes, so people were more or less at the same level, financially speaking. Obviously there were the really poor and some probably significantly rich, but the most people weren't really either. Then throughout the 20s, industry and the the economy recovered and improved, and then the global Great Depression started in 1928. After the Depression, there was an even greater economic boom, and Finland recovered faster than the rest of Europe, pretty much. Especially a lot of the infrastructure, road network with cars in mind was being built. A lot of cars came to Finland in the beginning of the 1920s. There were very few cars, but in the end of the 1920s there were a lot of cars, at least in the cities in Finland. The difference is really striking. And everything in the utilities like water, electricity, gas, all these things became normal, common in the cities. Because there was still not that much capital in the country, the state either founded or bought a lot of businesses in the industries to compete with the private sector, and that was useful for the economic growth. The population in the countryside grew so fast that though a lot of people were moving into the cities, it didn't really change the number of the people living in the countryside, or the population remained at the same level anyway. A lot of new farming techniques and things like tractors and fertilizers from abroad, things like that, increased productivity. Also, there were many years of good weather, so productivity in the countryside was also very good. And people had this ideal of being self-sufficient, so people, especially in the countryside, wanted to own their own piece of land, piece of forest or woodland, whatever, maybe some swamp where they could get some peat from, and their own cattle, their own chickens, things like that. They made their own clothing. So this still even in the 1930s, really. And this meant that the countryside was doing well and the cities were doing well, and people were generally doing well throughout the country. Of course, not everyone, but generally speaking. So Finland was really not at all like a developing country in that sense anymore, which it had been in the end of the previous century. So things like water closets, bathrooms that function with water, and plumbing and central heating and these sort of things, these became the norm in cities, and to some extent even in the countryside. And healthcare improved quite a lot, social security in some ways. The school system was very much improved, and these all also in the countryside. The difference between the middle class and the lower classes just kept on getting smaller. The Second World War in Finland started in the winter of 1939. So it's called the Winter War, this part of the whole Second World War. In Finland, people, at least in the past when I was in school, people still didn't really think of the Second World War as something to do with Finland. Like, people are used to thinking of the wars of Finland as separate, or at least they were, some decades ago. I think perhaps, I hope, these days people are more aware that these wars of Finland were really just part of the Second World War. So the Russians and the Germans had divided Eastern Europe amongst themselves in the secret deals before Russia started the attack to Finland. But obviously Finland had no knowledge of this, and they had the Russians, had tried to negotiate a certain exchange of certain areas before this, which Finland did not agree upon, and if they had, it might have been a bad idea, considering that they are probably gonna attack anyway. So Russia attacked, but because Stalin had really done some stupid things, like moved whole peoples around the Empire of Russia, the soldiers attacking Finland were from areas that had no experience of winter, real winter. They didn't know how to ski, and they were very much disadvantaged. Also, I suppose most of their leadership was inexperienced or, completely untrained to lead, because the earlier leaders had been executed, the generals and such. The idea, I suppose, of having people from far away attacking Finland was probably because Stalin or the military leadership there thought that these people would have little moral or psychological difficulty attacking Finland. The people from nearby might have had more qualms about it, but anyway, that ended up having the really for the Russians or Soviet Union a bad effect of having the inexperienced people trying to attack who didn't know how to fight in the winter, at first anyway. And it was a really cold winter. It was the second coldest winter in the decade. The coldest one was in 41 to 42. But so also the communists in the Soviet Union thought that most of the people in Finland would welcome a communist rule and would rebel in Finland, but none of that happened because things were actually pretty well in Finland at that time, and they already had this Finnish national identity by this time and saw Soviet Union as Russia just attacking once again, which it actually was. So Finland didn't really have much of an army at this point, so they got a lot of volunteers to fight though, and a lot of people just saw it as their duty to defend the country, and they joined the army, but the army didn't have uniforms even for these people, so a lot of people had just I think called cockard in their hat and kind of a soldier's belt, and some of them I think used even their own hunting rifles. So it was no surprise that this kind of an army could not really defeat or even hold back the Russian army indefinitely. But, the aforementioned factors, conditions, the winter, a lot of snow, cold, inexperienced attackers who also didn't have proper equipment, all these things meant that the Soviet Red Army could not occupy the country, for example. They could not defeat Finland completely, but they did get Finland to sue for peace, and next spring a peace was made. So weirdly, I think some uneducated Finnish people still think that, for weird reasons, that Finland won the Winter War, but they did not. I mean, Finland lost the Winter War, just like it lost every war it was in. Because, the first was the Civil War, and in my opinion, there are no winners in civil wars, because it just means death and destruction for everyone. No one gains anything, really. So then the Winter War, it was a defeat for Finland. There were some area losses, and Finland was forced to accept this kind of peace. So it's clearly a defeat. But even though there was now peace, people were kind of afraid that that's not going to last, because the Soviet Union annexed the Baltic countries and, all the things that happened during that time. And so the people in Finland were afraid that eventually there will be another attack. And also a surprisingly large number of Finnish people also thought that Finland might have a chance actually of getting back all the lost areas, and or maybe even a bit more. People were talking about a greater Finland, really crazy nationalistic bullshit, but that's what people believed. Also, it was connected to racism, and there were quite a few Nazis in the country back then. And there still are some. But anyway, then basically the first chance there was, Finland allied itself with Germany. No one else would help Finland at this point, I suppose, certainly not after this alliance, which Finnish people have always been eager to distinguish actually from an actual alliance. They've been talking about like Finland fighting side by side, sort of together with the Germans, but they've been trying to downplay the alliance, but it's pointless. It was really an alliance, as far as I know. A big army of Germans came to Finland, mostly in the northern part of the country, and so Finland, the Finnish leadership clearly wanted them there, and there was a joint attack on the Soviet Union, and this war is known as the continuation war, because from the Finnish perspective, just continued the previous war, the Winter War, and it didn't go well, of course. It wasn't clear to the Finnish people that there was a moral justification for this war. There was a lot of sympathy for the Allied side, the anti-German side of the Second World War. But so Finland was now on the wrong side of history, fighting with the fucking Nazis. So anyway, this didn't end up too well because, as you probably know, Germany lost. But before this happened, Finland was seeing how things are going, and some of the cities were bombed a bit by the Soviets. And in 1944, the Red Army made a massive assault on various fronts, actually, against Finland, and it became clear to the Finnish leadership that this is it. There's no winning this anymore. So it was all about just trying to prevent the Russians, or the Red Army, from occupying the whole country, and just basically slowing down their attack. And importantly, the battles at Tali-Ihantala, for example, that's a special, very important battle for Finland, meant that the Red Army was slowed down enough, and also because the Soviets were now competing with the Western powers in the basically run to Berlin, so they wanted to be the first to conquer Berlin, and didn't want to have the troops tied up in Finland anymore. So this made it possible for Finland to get a conditional surrender and peace. But this meant that now Finland had to change sides and kind of like turn their coats and push the German army out of Finland. So this was a condition of the peace with the Soviet Union, and this was done. And this was the third part of the Second World War then for Finland, known as the War of Lapland. So that was the war against Germans. So these were the same people the Finnish soldiers, the Finnish army had been fighting with against the Soviet Union just a while ago, and now suddenly they were enemies. They were supposed to be killing these people they had been fighting with, on the same side. So this wasn't really a nice thing, but when the retreating Germans started destroying pretty much everything in Lapland, it became easier for the Finnish soldiers to also fight against them. And eventually they were pushed out, and then eventually the whole World War ended, and Finland had to pay a lot of reparations to the Soviet Union, which was kind of a matter of pride, I suppose, also. And a lot of people around the world apparently were impressed by how eagerly and how completely Finland paid those reparations to the Soviet Union. After the war, all the way to the present, Finland has had an army that is surprisingly big compared to the population, but it's based on conscription. And these days it's possible for women to also serve in the military, but it's mandatory to serve one way or another if you're a man. So that's something for another video. After the war, the Second World War, Finland became pretty quickly a welfare state, following the example of England and the Scandinavian countries. And the heavy reparations to the Soviet Union, which for a big part involved building a lot of heavy industry and a lot of technology, because much of these reparations were paid in kind. They were not paid in money only. During the wartime, there had been rationing, and this was still used for some years after the war. So people couldn't just buy whatever they wanted. They needed to have those little paper slips to allow them to buy stuff. There were some economic setbacks, like after the war, that is, in the 70s there was the oil crisis, and in the 90s there was the really big depression starting in 1990, I think, or 91. But generally speaking, the people who grew up after the war was the first and possibly only generation in Finland who really had things easy, in the sense that they had the welfare state taking care of them. They had good education, they had health care, they had a social security network, they had a high standard of living, and especially a huge growth in access to information, not just from the schools, but then newspapers, all the popular culture, the albums, radio, then TV, and finally the internet. So things really changed quite dramatically. And stuff like flying to especially Mediterranean resorts for just a vacation became a thing, I think in the 80s for the most part. So this was really something completely new. Also, this includes the whole introduction of the consumerist culture, not just all sort of plastic things, but the clothing, for example. People, at least to the war and probably in the 60s, when there was a new industrialization boom, people had been making their own clothing for the most part even, and all these things. But now these things were being bought and sold. So urbanization, industrialization, and service economy, basically, all of these things happened at the same time in Finland. In other countries, usually these happened consecutively, but in Finland at the same time. The importance of education has always been a high priority in Finland, which can be seen, for example, in how in the 60s and 70s a lot of the students in higher education were women, and the birth rate for the year 1973 was the lowest ever, for example. So because of so many women going to universities and other institutions of education. The standard of living can also be seen in the fact that Finland introduced a 5-day work week in the 60s, and a lot of machinery was being used in households, like washing machines. So now the majority of the people were, or at least considered themselves to be, middle class. So this is part of, I suppose, the welfare ideology, because the idea is that the middle class protects the whole society by stabilizing it. In the 1990s, Finland was already profiling itself as a country of high technology and education, and at the time a very successful big company, Nokia, started making the cell phones and making Finland really well known all across the world. So this brings us to the end of the 20th century and the end of this video. I know it's not much, but if you found this somehow useful or, I don't know, entertaining, I don't think so, but